des Nouvelles de Monsieur de Lapérouse, Louis XVI supposedly inquired on the steps leading to the guillotine. Although the king's question is surely apocryphal, one of the enduring images of the imprisoned royal family is an engraving of the Dauphin receiving a geography lesson from his father. We cannot know if the king was imagined to have shown his son the route taken by his star explorer on the scientific expedition that left Brest, seeking Enlightenment discoveries to rival those of Cook. What is certain is that by the time the royal family awaited their fate, Lapérouse and his crew had long since vanished. The mystery of what befell the Lapérouse expedition haunted the revolution all the more because the ships were expected home just before the Bastille fell. It continued to haunt the Directory, Consulate, Empire, and Restoration, in each attempt to locate Lapérouse failed miserably. The ships had left Botany Bay in March 1788 with plans to arrive in Ile-de-France by December and in Europe by mid-1789, carrying naval officers, surgeons, and engineers alongside astronomers, meteorologists, natural scientists, and artists. The Astrolabe and Boussole expected to make scientific, not colonial progress. The myth of the exhibition's discoveries was all the more powerful because copies of the ship's logs, maps, drawings, and a travelogue by Lapérouse had been sent ahead on land with a messenger voyaging 12,000 kilometers by foot across Russia to arrive at Versailles in October 1788. Thanks to Lesseps' heroic preservation of those documents, a near complete account of the voyage was in the hands of the court before the revolution and fueled attempts during the following decades to locate the lost mariners. The National Assembly in 1791 ratified a plan to send a mission. Departing in 1792, Bruni d'Ancastros' Recherche and Espérance were as doomed as the expedition he sought. Still hoping for news, but now driven by scientific colonialism, in 1800, Napoleon sent Baudin to his death at sea. The whereabouts of the Lapérouse ships remained unknown until 1826, when an Irish adventurer named Dillon purchased a French sword guard from an indigenous trader on a Pacific island. In 1828, a French navigator, Dumont d'Urville, viewed a submerged vessel. Even then, the explorer's fate was shrouded in mystery into the late 20th century when the wreckage was explored. We today are sure that both Lapérouse's ships wrecked on coral reefs off Vanikoro in the Solomon Archipelago in June 1788. This paper explores the representation of Lapérouse and his voyage. My corpus has included state publications, commemorative sculpture, paintings, prints, wallpaper, plays, fake travelogues, and accounts of sightings. Concentrating on the years between 1788 and the disappearance and the debris discovery in 1826, this paper analyzes how the lost expedition was constructed in the post-revolutionary decades. Imaginary shipwrecks and desolate islands. My inquiry into the representations of the lost navigators. How do phantasmatic accounts of the end of the expedition transform perceptions of what is far beyond the horizon, as well as what is visible at home in France? What did Europeans of 1788 to 1828 discover through the lost explorations of Lapérouse? Even before the Lapérouse expedition had reached the South Pacific, it inspired monuments to dead sailors. On the 13th of July, 1786, just inland from the southeast coast of Alaska, 21 of Lapérouse's men perished while sounding the channel. The men erected a monument on Île du Cénotaphe à la mémoire de nos malheureux compagnons. 2 decades later, Crépin's painting of the naufrage des canots de Lapérouse au port français captivated the Salon of 1806. Note that the title designates the wrecked boats as belonging to Lapérouse, as if already naming his loss through that of his men. The Crépin canvas itself is peculiarly hopeful. Nearly all of the 21 soldiers in the foreground are still afloat. One chaloupe has courageously come to the aid of another, from which several sailors risk toppling into the bay. In the distance, raised arms and alarmed bodies bob above the waves. This third boat hangs back, barely saving its own crew. Because the painting was commissioned by Alexandre de la Borde in memory of his older brothers, one can guess these are the two young men balancing precariously while throwing a rope to those about to be pitched overboard. By contrast, in Ozanne's representation, included in the posthumous atlas of 1798, the boats are already lost, the crew on the verge of drowning. No heroism remains possible. The only option is to grab onto debris and try to save oneself. Both these works nonetheless operate in an elegiac mode that emphasizes in critic Chaussard's words la terreur et la pitié of ce regard dans lequel on se lit la certitude du naufrage. Anxiety about a myriad of losses accumulated over the preceding two tumultuous decades manifests itself here through a language of anti-revolutionary sublime. But that anxiety is channeled through depictions of patriotic values that collated as easily with Republican projects as with the Napoleonic heroism of the Empire's wars. And all these obsessions turn on a representation given flesh through the certainty of wreckage that can be shown and mourned, whereas yet other, just as certain losses of the post-revolutionary moment remain immaterial and unspeakable. For all the chaos of the revolutionary years, as France wondered if any news might come from Lapérouse, one man nonetheless set about to make memorials, not just of the dead of Paul des Français, but by extension to all those lost on the Lapérouse expedition. Jean-Joseph de la Borde collaborated with Hubert Robert in the 1780s to create one of the most extravagant gardens of Europe. There, even before the ships went missing, he erected the first French memorial to Lapérouse's expedition. The plan had been to celebrate his son's participation, but in 1787, upon receiving news of their demise, Laborde transformed his planned rostral column on the left into a sepulchral monument. Intriguingly, in the designs for the Méréville Gardens, Laborde père had already created a memorial to Captain James Cook, the first in continental Europe. In life, Cook towered over 18th century exploration. In death, his figure was now interwoven with the losses of the Lapérouse expedition. Monuments to Cook always overflow the loss they seem designed to stage. Eulogizing Cook for his achievement can only be accompanied by an encounter with his death, a death that increasingly activated uncomfortable stories about the lost French expedition. This loaded mourning project became all the more invested for the Laborde heir as they reclaimed the garden in the Napoleonic era after their father's guillotining and their own exile. These private revolutionary losses now swelled the public stories of mourning told through the garden's memorial monuments. The tragedy of the lost expedition was channeled synecdochically through the son's deaths. The anticipated glory of discovery has transmuted into an empty funerary urn that now signifies, through Cook's monument on the right, another captain's body, that of Lapérouse, that has not been reclaimed from the Pacific. The interchangeability of the two explorers' deaths now mask their radical differences, turning Cook's violent demise into an unspeakable subtext for multiple losses. The self constituted as observer through the garden's itineraries is supposed to discover the tableau de nature, to enjoy sans cesse et sans peine. But Méréville is always on the verge of plunging into a certitude de naufrage from which there is no coming back. The French had appropriated Cook in the 1780s as a way of giving narratives to the hopes then fears about the Lapérouse expedition. They continued in the revolutionary and post-revolutionary period to instrumentalize his voyages in ways that were crucial to the imagining of the Pacific. Through costume studies as here, wallpaper, and theatricals, they even helped the British to find the very narratives in pantomime in the Leverrier Museum that launched Cook into the stratosphere of modern celebrity. The Leverrier collection would be dispersed at auction in 1806. The French state was more protective of its hero's legacy. Before a makeshift memorial in the Louvre Naval Museum could reframe in the 1830s the narrative, the French Sailors were, however, continually revived on desolate islands. Until Dillon's discoveries of 1826, the French had confronted 40 years of mystery about what had befallen the Lapérouse exhibition. Today, thanks to archaeological diving between 2005 and 2017, most questions have been resolved. We still don't know, however, what happened to the survivors. Did two men really remain behind on Vanikoro after other survivors sailed away on a makeshift vessel? Did anyone on the salvage boat survive a wreck or attack? These are precisely the questions obsessing early writings about the Lapérouse expedition, including a fake survivor's diary, a Baudelaire's biography, several plays, and an illustrated epic poem that took up their own sensationalistic versions of the wreck. For the first 20 years after the expedition was lost, Lapérouse's name resonated with hearsay and fabrication. Imperialist fantasies accompanied racist depictions of sailors among the sauvages, many of which already had significant currency in the Cook pantomimes and museum displays. Many of these works were obsessed with blaming, the Cook pantomimes and museum displays in Paris and London. New twists appeared in German and British plays depicting Lapérouse. Many of these works were obsessed with blaming the French Revolution as if liberty and equality had prevented Lapérouse from returning home. Although these works rarely reached Paris stages, their popularity resonated all the way to France. Just as the French had set Covent Garden on fire with their Cook apotheosis, the English reframed Lapérouse's disappearance as a domestic melodrama with anti-republican undertone. The official account, by contrast, struggled to interest readers. The memoir of his trip across Siberia was rushed into publication in 1789 to distract from a growing awareness that Lapérouse's two ships were lost. Lesseps' narrative became a much translated bestseller at home and abroad. Lapérouse's official travelogue, however, flopped. Announced with fanfare in April 1798, this work supposedly was attendu avec impatience par les savants et les marins de la France et de l'Europe entière. 1,800 copies of its 4 volumes and illustrated atlas were printed, but wound up remaindered. Perhaps the scientific community was too strapped financially to welcome the navigator's research. The racy Voyage d'un ténor, an imaginary travelogue to ancient Greece, published in 1797, may well have stolen Lapérouse's thunder. Perhaps the Paris population was too busy, strolling in the Tivoli gardens, observing air balloon descents, and attending readings at the Lycée Républicain. Or perhaps travel, even armchair travel, was more than the directory's new elites were prepared to imagine. Whatever caused Lapérouse to be abandoned on the shelves of the directory's Nouveau Paris did not, however, prevent the fashionistas of Europe from flocking to plays that gave Lapérouse a new life on what one of them called the Desolate Island. As early as February 1798, a Paris theater staged La mort du capitaine Lapérouse ou la cruauté anglaise. A small storm of Lapérouse plays followed in European capitals. The most successful German playwright of his era, Kotzebue, set terms for the era's fantasies by sending Lapérouse's wife on a rescue mission that culminated in a melodramatic battle on an uninhabited island in the South Seas between two competing marital claims. On the one hand, the traditional French family, represented by a woman called Adélaïde, though Lapérouse's wife was actually named Éléonore, with her son Heinrich, though he had no children, and her brother Clerville. And on the other side, the play represented the castaway's indigenous partner, Malvina, who saved him from drowning, then murdered by her brother. This Eliza Doolittle of colonization, as Christopher Baum calls her, serves to establish the potential of la mission civilisatrice, even in the most precarious circumstances, through her adoption of the French language and Catholicism. When the rescue ships arrive, and with them Adélaïde, Pérouse, as he's called, initially casts his wife as his sister, but eventually must choose between the two women. Comic sequences are juxtaposed with Malvina's suicide attempts and Adelaide's poignant appeals. Meanwhile, the radical transformations of revolutionary France are conveyed by Clerville, who characterizes France as our degenerated country, devoured by anarchia, and inspired by these royalist diatribes, the motley group finds a solution whereby Lapérouse can have his native cake and eat it too. Rather than returning to France, the navigator decides to remain on the island where the two women will live as sisters in one hut, while Lapérouse will live in a second hut, ostensibly celibate. Clerville, meanwhile, sets sail for England to bring back French émigrés, potentially the London and Berlin audiences, to help found a colony. Kotzebue's play inspired endless knockoffs over the next decade. In Berlin, Hamburg, and London, the play encountered moral outrage and censorship over the ménage à trois. In 1801, an adaptation in the form of a pantomime, Pérouse or the Desolate Island, captivated London's Theatre Royal, enduring in provincial playhouses for 2 decades. It was published along with a phantasmatic life of Lapérouse that perpetrated the fictional desert island Retrouvailles through an engraving representing the explorer's wife fainting upon recognizing her husband. Note how the skins hanging from tree branches and a makeshift wooden house seemed to threaten metonymically what commentators increasingly feared Lapérouse had met. The threat of cannibalism looms large over the plays to come, transporting myths about the fragmented body of Captain Cook, along with long-enduring fantasies about South Sea savages. The London pantomime grew ever more ornate with its staging, including an army of chimpanzees, a hungry bear, and even visiting Native Americans. Madame Pérouse is barely saved from a native islander, and Pérouse himself is about to be immolated before he's freed by a chimpanzee with a pistol. Whereas in Kotzebue, the naval expedition that has brought Madame Pérouse to the island is invisible, here the French military assaults on stage. This martial music, gunfire, thus permit Pérouse and his French family to return to France. While critics complained that Pérouse had been transformed into a mere vehicle for pageantry, frippery, and puerile exhibition. The play had enough staying power to be vaunted in 1808 as, quote, forming a more interesting pantomime than had ever appeared on any stage, and in 1818 as, quote, the established favorite. In the circus-like atmosphere that reinvented the basic facts of the French expedition, as well as the locations to which Lapérouse might have traveled, the play could expand its racist, colonialist, ideological values in the service of an extravagant spectacle. The anthropomorphized chimpanzees, as Jocelyn Lincoln points out, are demonstrated as more humane than the indigenous people. Kotzebue's enterprising Malvina, who proposed a solution to the love triangle, here transmutes into an emblem of self-sacrifice. The expedition's scientific acquisitions are erased amid domestic triangles and colonial warfare. We never learn in any of these plays, or in ones that came later, what became of Lapérouse's men or their 3 years of scientific exploration. At most, the ships are declared wrecked, the men all drowned, and Lapérouse miraculously saved by a native girl's appreciation of his physique. Restoring Lapérouse to marital fidelity seems to require a huge theater filled with dancing chimpanzees and grunting, black-faced savages. The closest the French of the post-revolutionary era came to evoking Lapérouse on stage was through references to the return of sailors lost at sea. In the very summer, when Lapérouse's journal languished at booksellers, crowds rushed to Les Fêtes à la Titus, the vaudeville of un marin français who, thwarting les dangers de la mer, for 4 years absence to find his wife, returns to find his wife, daughter, and her boyfriend, tricked out in the latest fashions, and coiffé à la Titus, in the hairstyle that evoked both the shorn hair of the guillotined as well as androgynous independence. Rather than taking offense, the returned husband embraces the values and styles of the Republic. In fact, he promotes the French government policy that year, turning pleasure into what Rebecca Spang has called, quote, an economic imperative for the nation, unquote. For this Rip Van Winkle of long-distance navigation can recognize the benefits of conspicuous consumption. While The Missing Mariner is in this and other directory plays seems interchangeable with The Revolutionary Dead and Émigré, they also literally evoke unspeakable narratives about French scientific pride and the depths of oceans out of which no navigators had emerged. Such tittering comedies gave the Parisians of this period a way of broaching the narratives that were too painful to read, much less own. Small wonder that during the Directory, when the government mooted closing all but highbrow theaters, the French did not leap to stage a production that mocked the very man whose heroism the government sought to project luxury production of his journals. In a year when it was hard to tear theatergoers away from phantasmagoria shows, no one wanted to risk reviving Lapérouse. The years between 1789 and 1805 were rife with rumors. Some claimed to have recovered a last survivor of the expedition who shared fragmentary information before expiring. In 1799, the Courrier des Spectacles reported news from Lapérouse. On dit qu'il a couru de grands dangers et que ce n'est que par miracle qu'il a échappé aux terribles accidents qui lui sont arrivés. During the Napoleonic Empire, nonetheless, press references and Lapérouse-related publications diminished. The catastrophic failure of the Doncaster mission and the absence of news from any other front left little doubt that the navigator was not coming back. The frontispiece of Esmenald's Pic de Navigation represented the loss in Alaska of Lapérouse's 21 sailors. Méry's representation focuses on the broken bodies of those drowning. Roiled by the waves, pulled down by the tide, the sailors in the foreground are already lost. It is hard to distinguish body parts from the rocks breaking them, even more difficult to connect limbs to bodies, surpassed by the forces of nature. Ghostly in the distance, a dark form seems to hang precariously from a frigate already lurching toward distant shores. In contrast to both Ozan's and Crapin's depictions we saw earlier, which place us at a distance from the commotion, here we are in the water too, barely at bay from those who are perishing. That impossible point of view on an impossibly visible spectacle embodies in forceful ways what the French of the period between 1789 and 1828 cannot represent. Crapin will heroize that vision, as we've seen, even as he substitutes the Alaskan certitude of the wreck for the unspeakable losses of the Revolutionary era. But he also provides another vantage point onto the catastrophe. There in the background on the right, so much a part of the shadowy landscape that you might have taken them for trees, are two indigenous men pointing at the scene. A typical strategy in landscape prints and paintings is to offer the viewers a position for modeling his or her own observation via a schematized looker in the foreground, as here in Duchy de Fancy's unpublished drawing. Crapin puts that model observer in the background, contrasting with the precarious vision of those in the third boat. And yet these two Tlingit are not placed in opposition to the anguished Frenchman. Replicating the stance of the two endangered Laborde brothers, they lean forward on their desolate island, as unable to save the men as we are. Greg Denning wrote that voices from the beach can be hard to hear. We know from Lapérouse's memoir of 1786 that the first people of the region had suffered their own catastrophic loss. Only weeks before, a new tidal wave swept away the navigator's men. Those mourning men are the first to confirm to the French what they've witnessed of the accident. And their own memorial is the last thing that Lapérouse sees after leaving behind his on Cenotaph Island. Just before pulling out onto the open sea, his ship encounters a moray, the memorial built by the first people of the region to honor their dead. Although Lapérouse there admires a sheath in a canoe alongside funerary boxes, he recounts in his journal that he chose to leave it intact. His respect for the conventions that surround the First Peoples' commemoration of their lost men suggests that he had already begun to listen for the voices from the beach. One can hope that whatever beach he washed up on whatever desolate islands, that he found, if only fleetingly, that kind of honor. Thank you.